Hey y'all, I'm Dan Hamilton, the host of the Next Gen Warrior podcast. As always, the Next Gen Warrior podcast is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush, the chairman of the Veterans Land Board. Today I have the awesome opportunity to sit down with Anthony Detoto. Anthony, thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about your military service, how you joined the service, and then your role at 1836 Veterans.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me. West Point graduate, first Gulf War, 2 platoon commands, a company command, 6 more years in the Reserve, National Guard, Connecticut and Ohio. Officially left duty in '99. Officially signed back in a little bit over 2 years ago.
Okay.
Joined as civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, serving the Secretary as senior civilian on the ground here in Texas. I think he told me at the time I was the 100th civilian aide invested, a program that goes back to the 1920s to try to provide a little bit of continuity to the Army's story out in the community. Sister services don't have a similar role, so it's really military writ large. It happened during Hurricane Harvey, the aftermath, so I think I was the first civilian aide to ever be invested outside the Pentagon, so we did it at Ellington Field.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
You said you did it at Ellington Field, is that correct?
Yes.
Interesting little overlap there. So my time with 123, Marine Corps Reserve Unit out of Houston, we drilled there at Ellington, so it's pretty crazy. When we were walking in and before we were on air, we were talking about the 1 degrees of separation.
Yeah.
And it is really close how so many veterans from different backgrounds have either gone to different places or come back here to Texas to continue to serve. I'm interested in talking about your current role now and how you're serving. What is your role with 1836 Veterans, and can you tell the audience, if they're unfamiliar with this program, what you're working on?
Sure, and many veterans, particularly if they're outside of Texas, would likely be unfamiliar. On the campus of Rice about 2.5 years ago, and Rice is one of those well-kept secret universities buried in the middle of Houston. The canopy of the trees would make you think you're up in the Northeast, but we sat out in the middle of the quad, and a bunch of millennials who were really good at making PowerPoints. I don't know when the Marines learned to do that. In the Army, it's a school called Cascades.
Just a few years ago, I think.
Yeah, so they were putting together great decks, but what they had a little bit of trepidation doing was raising capital.
Okay.
And so 1836, paying homage or homage, depending on where you're from, to the great state of Texas, and when we went independent, was a little bit of a double entendre. 1836 to signify our history here in Texas, but these millennials needed $35,000 to bring a group called Bunker Labs to the great city of Houston. And so I figured 36 is bigger than 35. It would keep us focused on the prize. And we set out. I said, well, if I put $5,000 in of non-dilutive capital, and I can encourage some others to do the same, that works. And I said, that's all we need. Well, we did that, and then I think I got a little smarter. I said, I'm just going to ask people for $1,000.
Right.
And $50,000 later, we had enough of a war chest where we could give a little bit of money to Bunker. J.P. Morgan Foundation followed us suit. They had done that in 15 other cities, and we appreciate their leadership in the space. They brought
veterans, Bunker Labs, or for veterans entrepreneurial groups?
For Bunker Labs specifically. And what they decided to do differently in Houston was they gave the money to a group called Combined Arms. I know you've had John Vorster on here. And Combined Arms then rationed some of it to 1836 so we could start to build out this ecosystem. John's
a great leader in the Houston area. I know Combined Arms does so much great work in Houston. So I apologize for interrupting, but I appreciate all of his hard work for veterans down in the Houston area.
Yeah, like you, pretty much recovered from his time in the Marine Corps. So,
yes, it takes a little bit.
But so 1836, we really set out to raise capital via what I call collisions. Okay. And it's something I took. I haven't had a unique idea in 51 years from the folks at Station Houston. Your Station Houston's called Capital Factory here.
Yes.
But it's a place where you're going to bump into people. Like we were talking earlier, show has not been homogenous to just veterans. It's people that are helping them. So we need to reach out to patriots that have an interest in helping veterans, because otherwise it's the proverbial self-licking ice cream cone.
And you're just talking to each other, and there's no one else outside of the bubble is hearing what we're saying.
Right. And I think particularly for veteran entrepreneurship, which is what we're focused on, and I'll come back to that, we want them to talk to non-veterans. We want them to talk to people that have a very different set of experiences, because if all I do is look at the world through my lens, I can't benefit from the wisdom that might come from that lens of another entrepreneur. So when we think about capital, the way that we talk about it is there's the obvious financial balance sheet capital. There's debt and there's equity. But I use the acronym FISH. Military types like you and I like these acronyms. FISH, F is financial, I is intellectual. So who else is going to be my advisor? Who's going to be the yin to my yang? Who's going to keep me out of my own way? A lot of statistics will say that co-founded companies are much better than single-founded companies. Good data to support that. And then S, the S in FISH, social. Where are my clients going to come from? Because unless I have something that I can produce for 50 cents and sell for $1 that somebody wants to purchase from me, in the traditional sense, that business is not going to be sustainable. H, human. Where's my talent pool going to come from? And then what we've kind of done with that fish is think about it in a boat, like a V. Vendors. So who is going to be how are we procuring, if we can, from other veterans? Okay, so I want to do business with veterans. Right before Christmas, there's always that little holiday where we do business with local businesses. Let's do business with veterans. So when we think about capital as it relates to 1836, I don't think there's anything super unique there. It's just how do we put the right people together at the right time? You need density. You need them to be in the right areas, and I also want to get them exposed to non-veterans.
So do you feel almost like you're bringing in capital, you're bringing in veterans and non-veterans, and you're trying to keep them in a room so that the friction creates great ideas and great businesses?
Sure. And one of the things we've done, I've got 2 young men, 10 and 12, my sons, that sometimes they tell me I'm using them as a prop, but I've brought them into the forum and we'll get together in a room of 100 people. I've done this up in the Woodlands, we've done it at the Texas Medical Center, I've done it at the Perot family offices. General Murray from Army Futures said we should do it over here. Geekdom wants me to bring it down to San Antonio. And what we'll do is I'll say, oh, okay, everybody that's an entrepreneur, put your hand in the room. Now, mind you, there's 12 people that are going to have 4 minutes to tell their story. And what we'll do is we'll start in an out room where they have a table like this and folks can come around and mix with them. That's about 45 minutes. And then we go into this room, we're all together, and I'll say, so entrepreneurs, put your hands in the air. Well, those 12 do, and there's probably another 10 or 15 that fancy themselves as an entrepreneur. They put their hand in the air. And I'll say, okay, and all the capital providers, anybody that's written a check into an entity in which they were not an operator, put your hand in the air. So they do. And I said, have you done it multiple times? Have you done it, if you have a bias for veterans? And I said, all right, now everybody that had their hand in the air about a check writer, put your hand up. I said, okay, now I think everyone that's ever written a check has their hand in the air. And my 10-year-old pushes through the crowd and he goes, Dad, I've been doing some research on the internet, so I know it's true. And it says right here, a veteran is somebody that's written a check for up to and payable their life, at least once in their life. So it makes everybody pause. He's in a little blue coat with a tie on, and now the room quiets. And I said, okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to run a little bit of a Shark Tank, except there's no cross-examination. I want you to listen for the F, I, S, H, and that V. And who do you know that could be doing business with them? They do not have the same networks as some. They've delayed their maturation on the business side because they went and served. And how can you help them get a little bit further faster? And all I want you to do is think about which one of those tables you're going to go belly up on the outside once we're done. And I'd love it if it was 2 or 3 of them. So let's get going. And then we'll start and we'll let them tell their story. And so I think it's just a chance for them to have a captive room to listen.
So when you were in the service, you're in the Gulf War, was raising capital and the idea of businesses and maybe the markets, was that something that was still very interesting to you, or was it something that after you left the military you felt like you needed to be involved in it, or it kind of caught your attention maybe later in life?
I think that often, so I was a combat engineer that was a scout platoon leader. So I tend to think, if you think across branches, and it's not just because I'm sitting with one, the Marines are the most entrepreneurial. Why? Because they have the least amount of resources, right?
So it's always figure it out when they're there.
You got to do it on the fly, right? And that's entrepreneurialism at the crux of it. So I think there was certainly pieces and parts. I was unreasonable. I was not a very reasonable officer. I was not very good in garrison. I was really good out in the field.
Because you were able to put things together and almost run it like a business, right? And say, how am I going to put the right people? Could you provide, or could you apply the FISH acronym while you were in the military? If you looked back on it, do you think that maybe there were traces of that before you actually applied FISH to the business world?
Sure. I'll go back to what you said earlier in this conversation about 1 or 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon or separation.
Yeah.
But you need to know who that supply clerk is, who's that chief warrant officer is, who the platoon sergeant is that can help you get things done. And if you approach them in a humble way and you ask for advice, sometimes you get paid twice, right? Regardless of what the currency is that you're dealing in.
That's actually a really interesting approach because I'm not an entrepreneur. Obviously work here in the state government for the Veterans Land Board and the GLO, but I have always thought that the entrepreneurial mindset and people like yourself have lessons that you can learn regardless if you're in a finance business or if you're running a business. You can still apply entrepreneurial lessons such as like marketing yourself or showing up on time or working with other people or collaborating, creating collisions. It can be applied regardless if you're working in state government or if you're a janitor or if you're running a business.
Sure. And again, I think Steve Jobs coined a term, best I could tell, called entrepreneurs. It was for his Mac developers in 1982. And I'm not an entrepreneur per se. I don't want P&L risk. I've always worked for that person that's willing to take it, but they don't want me to behave like the others. They want me to be some sort of change agent within an environment. And so I think whether it's GLO or state government, whether you're the head of the Student Veterans Association, right? You use your platform for what it's for and to get the most out of it.
What do you think is success for the businesses that these veterans are creating or veterans who are raising capital? How would you define it?
So in the vernacular, and this is the child of a Latin major mom who taught English, but victory and success were tied to war. Okay. Right, and the mission of the infantry, Marines probably at the close with end, right?
Destroy the enemy.
And so this notion of success, I think, I view it more as part of the path, right? So that's the paper definition, but it's not necessarily the destination; it's the journey, right? It's living a very full life, and I'm not one of those that balances very well. I am who I am.
Sure.
This 1836 is an unpaid venture. It's an avocation for me, not a vocation. I'm not paid to do that.
Right.
I mean, I left a 12-year stint at a 20-year young organization that was really good at supporting me for a really large bank because one of their 3 priorities in the Houston market is supporting veterans. So.
And that's something that's obviously very passionate, or something that you're very passionate about. Could you tell somebody who maybe has been in the service for 12 years or for 15 years, 20 years, who is considering coming to the Houston area or considering coming back to Texas, what do you think are maybe some thoughts or ways that they could prepare themselves for coming back into the civilian world?
Sure. You already had Combined Arms on, but there's many that are coming back to Houston because of the services that are being delivered by Combined Arms. So there's 40 different plus, and it's probably closer to 60 now, different delineated services that somebody might need in that period of transition. What I would say is Texas in general is a really welcoming environment. I'll give you a quick anecdote, flashback, post 9/11. We lived in San Francisco. We're crossing Market Street. Some of the protesters were spitting on the police officers. Not their proudest moment. Flash forward, Army was playing TCU at their homecoming. We flew down to Fort Worth, standing room only crowd. They walked out 80 members of the local community that served in Vietnam, and they said, "This is too little too late, but we appreciate your service." They marched out 120 members of the local community who signed up for the military.
Wow.
And my wife kind of elbowed me and she said, "Hey, these are our people. Like, we should be here."
Right.
So that Texas writ large is there, Combined Arms for Houston. And then we have a mayor, Sylvester Turner, that said, if not for my 3 elder siblings, happens to be a Harvard UT guy, and not for my 3 elder siblings who all served in the military, I could never have pursued this path of public service. He said I literally stood on their shoulders. If not for them, he was 1 of 9, right?
That's
so how do you do that in a family like that?
I didn't know that story. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think, so that actually goes to something that we talk about at this table a lot of times, kind of breaking down some of the barriers between the veterans community, the civilian community, trying to almost make them interchangeable. And that's something I think you've been able to do pretty well at 1836 Veterans as well as at Capital Factory. Can you tell me about the relationships that you've built outside of the veterans community?
Yeah, and so our local Capital Factory in Houston is called Station Houston. It's going to be called Ion. They're taking that old iconic Sears building that's a little bit of an eyesore now downtown, and they're putting a lot of money and focus. Why? Because they need these collisions. So I think, again, to hubs to the spoke, Gabby Rowe, who runs that center, General Murray here in town, how do you break down barriers? The head of the Greater Houston Partnership, which is like a Uber area chamber of commerce. He was a former first in his first in his class at A&M. That's awesome. And so people have an appreciation for the Corps, maybe weren't always in the Corps, right? But they were there and they stood side by side. I think it's identifying these patriots that weren't veterans, but really now they kind of feel like, man, I really feel like I missed something there.
Yeah.
And I want to do something good for those that are outside. I think it's important that it's, I don't know what you call the typical, in the Navy call him Ted, the typical enlisted dude, and the Army call him Joe. I don't know if the Marines have a terminology, but want to break down that barrier where you and I are standing around the water cooler talking about our salon quality hair, right? And you know, we want to talk about things that are meaningful. What's going to help me build a minimum viable product? You know, what's monthly recurring revenue look like? How do I make this thing grow? So either I can keep this and it's for a lifestyle plus business, or I can attract external investors. And that's not the stop point. That's just so I can grow this and make it much more meaningful. And I would tell you, I'm sure people have stopped you, and sometimes it feels great, sometimes it feels empty, where they say, hey, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
What I really appreciate are those that create jobs, right? Yeah. So I feel that way about CEOs of small business, because all big businesses do is eat jobs. The small businesses, we
create things within their communities.
And it supports other families.
Yeah. So I'm interested to know how you balance a couple different things. So you talked about your vocation versus your avocation. That's correct, right? Yeah. So let's say there's a veteran out there who says, hey, I'm going to work, I'm putting in my time in my 9 to 5. Maybe I don't find, it's not as exciting as I want it to be, and I'm interested on maybe taking another task, or maybe volunteering, building business, whatever it may be. How are you able to balance your time and energy between what your 9 to 5 is and then the time that you spend with 1836 veterans?
Yeah. Well, look, I've been married to my wife for 20 years. We have a 12 and a 10-year-old. I wanted to make sure she liked me first. It hadn't worked out real well for the rest of the folks in our family. So we used to focus on at-risk youth and women that didn't have a hand up in society. And then over time, it's kind of just pivoted. And you make times. I think somebody said to me recently, every time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else, right? So that's the balance. It's that answer. It's what's the better and higher use. When I was 23 years old on my battalion commander's hood of his Humvee in Udari, Kuwait, and he said, you want to get out? And you can have my job in 18 years.
Right.
And, it made Austin today feel tepid at the time. It's just, it's like, yes, sir, I'm sure I can.
In the middle of the summer here,
I want to impact more people than I feel like I'm going to impact in a staff job for the next 7 years.
So it is really for you, maybe what drives you or what you're interested in the reason that you work outside of your normal job is because you love having that impact on different areas of your community.
Yeah, I think, is it David Brooks' new book called Second Mountain? I don't think you have to wait until you're done with something to start something else. What I would say, and take exception to, when you were in the Marines, you didn't work 9 to 5, right? And I think there's way too many people that think they're just going to put in that time. If you have a 9 to 5, you should at least put in 45 or 50 if you're a veteran, right? Because that's what you know. You have more time after that. There's plenty of folks that are working 80, 90-hour weeks. You don't need to do that. But what I worry about is guys that are young in their career thinking about entrepreneurship too early, because lifetime of service to the nation can come in many forms. You doing it for the military, I think, is a calling, right?
Yeah. What do you think are some of the traits that best run businesses have? And maybe the people might be some of what I'm most interested in.
Sure. Bill Gates' book, The Road Ahead, he put a CD in the back. He wrote it a long time ago. He said, bring me failures fast, right? Bring me bad news fast. And certain businesses where they don't want to hear about what's not working, like they go earmuffs.
Yes. They kind of hide it, put it in a corner, and
the modern philosopher Will Ferrell in the movie. Yes. Yeah, old school. Yeah. But you want to make sure that you're in an environment where hey, this isn't working. Can we talk about this? I think that's really important. I think being resilient, being gritty, having an appreciation for what the team does to collaborate is all really important in making sure that business is successful.
Why do you enjoy being a part of 1836 Veterans?
Look, people have helped me. When I got out of the military, at active duty, went to go to reserve, I went to the Marriott Marquis, and rookie Mayor Rudy Giuliani bumped me as the speaker. At the table was Hal Moore, Buddy Buca, these folks that, a couple of Medal of Honor winners,
Wow.
Mike Daly, 43X from West Point. I was so scared, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I went to the one in New York, I went to the one in Connecticut on the following weekend. These are alumni dinners for West Point, and the one in Boston, Hanscom's Air Force Base. And the job of the youngest graduate from West Point at this dinner, so at West Point was founded in 1802.
Yeah.
So 217 years of history unhampered by progress, okay?
That's
Part of this
pretty
is the youngest and the oldest grad get to talk at each of these dinners. And I thought, okay, I know my job is to keep this speech short.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk about either our education training or character building. Well, I'll just talk about character building. I'll just talk about day one. They walk you down to an auditorium, Eisenhower Hall, filled with 1,158 new cadets, and they ask the following groups of people to stand up. All those of you who were valedictorian high school. Well, like 120 stood up. And all those of you that were the top 5% of your class, well, another 400 stood up. And all those of you who were captain of the varsity athletic team, 220 stood up. And all those of you who were president of your student body, another 185 stood up. And I figured at that point, the only question left was, Anthony Detoto, would you like to stand up, right? So we all feel that way at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's what makes us stronger and better. I think that it's what you do with that, not necessarily, the fact that you get knocked down. I mean, I'm telling my boys all the time, it's we win or we learn. That's all there is, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, because we talk about that a lot here. Is how do you get, how can we convince or get it into the mindset of the veterans community that after you leave the service, if you fail or if you stumble, you're just learning, and you will do that for the remainder of your life. It may look different than PTSD. It may look different than the anxiety and depression that has come with wartime circumstances. But if you learn to learn and you drive yourself forward, you can still contribute to your communities in extremely valuable ways, whether that's raising capital for veterans businesses, that's being a teacher in your community, being a police officer. We want to find ways where we can get the veterans community to think, my struggles aren't the defining aspect of me, and I can continue to serve despite a lot of those difficulties.
Sure.
Another question that I want to ask you is, we talk at this table about the successes of veterans and the struggles they have. I'm kind of interested to know if you have thought about what are maybe some of the traits that you see may hamper veterans within business. Yeah. And I sometimes see veterans, maybe the rough edges in the military culture that sometimes have to be refined over time to fit into the right circles or to speak to the right people, whether it's the way you dress or anything specific that has stuck out to you in your time since leaving the service?
Yeah, I mean, Semper Fi and Hua don't translate really well, right? So you have to learn a new vernacular for the group that you're with. And I was with a somebody I've mentored for a long time this morning. He just said he's a New Yorker and it doesn't trade down south, and he just has to slow down a little bit. So I would just say that's one example of it. You do definitely have to demilitarize the resume. It doesn't command is manage or led. You have to put things in that form. I would say one of the prescient pieces I've seen has come out of a local school. Some professors that thought UT was too big went to Acton, and they wrote a piece called Naive Networking, and it talks about. I've thought about just rewriting it for veterans because there's some nuances, but it's basically, how do you not waste the time of an entrepreneur if you're going to go spend time with them? What should you know ahead of time before you go into that meeting? I think veterans would be really well prepared to read that piece. Yeah. They have another one called...
Can you say the name of the piece again?
Naive Networking from the Acton Institute. Okay. The other companion piece I've seen people retell their story better is it's something called a T letter. It's a cover letter. So instead of leaving the job description the way it is, say, so you draw a T on the paper, you put what their requirements here and your experience here. Okay. What it does is it flummoxes the HR manager. They have to push it forward because it doesn't look like the standard boilerplate, and then they know that you're not sending it out to 1,000 people. You couldn't have done it that way.
So is there anything that we haven't brought up here today that you would like to leave the audience with? Maybe a question that you wished I would have asked?
Sure. I think the one thing, it's been one of my failures as I've been trying to help folks in transition. It's to understand that veterans need a little bit of patience. They sometimes they're so restricted in the chain of command that they're used to. The notion of connectivity and creativity is lost on them. Mm-hmm. And I've been in forums where we've been with great leaders, the CEO of 7-Eleven, Joe DePinto, the CEO of JetBlue, Joel Peterson, the FAO Schwartz COO, True Green Lawn Care. Wow. And we've said, hey, tell us, you're not going to be in a room like this again anytime soon. Tell us how we can help you. And they couldn't answer the question.
The veterans couldn't provide.
And what I've come to realize over time is when a veteran's transitioning, they don't know what they want to do next. But what they're pretty sure of, it's not going to have as much purpose as what they just did. Mm.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for providing that guidance. That's obviously something that we talk a lot about here at Next Gen Warrior. And if you're watching at home and you're a veteran at home, you may feel like what you did in the service may not be surpassed in value, but I know, along with Anthony here, that your continued service in our communities is extremely valuable to the schools, it's valuable to the families, it's valuable to the businesses, and I think the people at large here in the great state of Texas. And so just encourage you to continue to find avenues where you can serve. It may look different, it may feel a little bit different, but I can promise you it is just as valuable to the people here as your services. And Anthony, I want to thank you for bringing those lessons learned here to this table today. Before we go, for the folks at home who are watching, they want to get plugged in with 1836 Veterans. They want to know more about what you're doing. Yeah. Where can they find that at?
Yeah, so 1836veterans.com. What I would encourage you to do is take a look at some of the companies that we've provided some capital to, intellectual capital, social and human, over financial in many instances. But look at Boodle AI, look at SecurityGate, look at Trumbull Unmanned. They're all led by veterans. They're doing interesting work. Look at what Scout Capital and Moonshot's doing. I think what you'll see is there's a lot of veterans that are trying to help veterans, and there's a lot of patriots that are outside that circle as well. I wanted to present you with my challenge coin.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's an honor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me here today.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for watching the Next Gen Warrior podcast. As always, brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and the Veterans Land Board. Thanks for being here, Anthony. We'll see you next time. Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior podcast.